Right. Hello, everybody. We're live. This is Tim Black from Northwest Arkansas. And next to me here is Dave Byle, who is in Berlin, Germany right now with his wife. And I'm just so happy that he's willing to come on. I know he's a busy guy doing street evangelism in Berlin and working for OM. And so thank you, Dave, for coming on. Now, we do have something in common. We're both guys from the Pacific Northwest.
Indeed.
And we all know that great things come out of the Pacific Northwest. You got your Microsoft, you got your Steve Prefontaine, but you also have the famous evangelist, David Byle. So now it's ironic that later on, David, we're going to be talking about someone who was very humble. So I'm not sure if I should have started out that way. But anyway,
good to be here with you, man.
Dave and I met each other. It was in Chicago, and it was the summer of 1992. And the Berlin Wall, it's interesting that he's in Berlin because the Berlin Wall had fallen in what, 89? Was it? 89.
Yes.
And so a group of us were, those of us interested in missions and so forth, some of you are so young, you won't remember this, but the Soviet Union just opened up. And people just flooded in, probably people who shouldn't have flooded in, but many people flooded in to share Christ. And Dave and I, at that time, I think I was a little more certain about where I wanted to go. And Dave was thinking things through where he wanted to be too. And we went.
I didn't know yet.
Yeah. So we went to Almaty, Kazakhstan and stayed with families. And I would say some of us were kind of checking out the place. Can we really live here? Should I bring my wife here to live? Think those kinds of questions. Others were, hey, this is a summer where we have limited time. Let's get on the streets. Let's share Christ. Yeah. And I was always really impressed with Dave's heart for that. He just wanted to use the time to share Christ, whenever and however he could. And so that's the history of Dave and I and how we met each other. But I'd like Dave to share about his background, how he got into missions, a little bit about the early days with OM and so forth. So Dave, please just take it away and tell us about yourself and so forth. So.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And boy, just even thinking back over the years, and it's been over 30 years now, and God's faithfulness too through it all. He's watched over us and brought us through thick and thin, and just looking back and say, what an amazing God, and what he does and how he watches over us. Just great to be here and to chat with your friends who will be watching this. And a little bit about myself. I have 2 passports. Actually, I tell people there's only one passport that counts, and that's the one that Jesus earned on the cross. And that one never expires, and no government can take that away from you. I've learned that the hard way.
Yeah.
But the earthly passports I have is a Canadian one because my dad was Canadian, born in Canada. And then an American one because my mom's American, and I actually grew up in Washington State. So right up in the Pacific Northwest, whether it was in Vancouver, British Columbia, or then for those of you who know Washington State, I was just north of Bellingham, way up in the corner there. So my parents actually had met in Bible college. They wanted to be missionaries, but to make a long story short, they were unable to do that. So they decided to be what we call senders rather than goers. So I grew up in a home where my parents were apparently always supporting missionaries, and they were praying for them because they would visit us. So we had, missionaries visiting us all the time. So I'd hear these stories, and I think that's probably where God planted the seed way back then.
Mm-hmm.
And then the real dangerous thing was reading the Bible, and especially the book of Romans. That just flipped my life upside down. And that's when God got a hold of me and really said, I just want to live for this Jesus. And not that I was perfect, lots of problems and this and that, but anyways, that happened when I was 11, 12 years old even.
Wow.
And I went through high school and ups and downs. That's a whole nother story. I can say what happened there, but I was thinking, do I want to go into just my dad had a business, and I could have very easily just after I finished college go there and help him run that business, or I could have followed this sort of dream that was in the back of my mind of maybe becoming a missionary, going into the world to bring the gospel to those who didn't know of Jesus. And I remember my first class in college, it was an economics class, and sitting there, it was a Christian college. So here's all these nice, good Christians all around me. And I loved the material. Economics was fascinating to me. I got a very good grade in the class. But at the end of as I was sitting in the class, I'm like, is this what I want? I mean, is there nothing more? Because it was as if all the other people in the room, all they wanted was to get married, have a nice house with a white picket fence, car in the front yard, dog in the backyard, and 1.6
American Dream
kids.
or
Yeah,
Canadian Dream or whatever.
Yeah, is this all there is to life? Surely there's got to be more. It just seems so boring to me. I don't know that. I think somehow God used that. So for me, that was just sort of the break. That is not the life for me. And so then, yeah, there was a group of Europeans who had come to my college to talk about these opportunities to go spread the gospel behind the Iron Curtain, because this is 1988. So as you remember, Tim, it was just the wall was about to come down. So I had a free summer. I'm like, yeah, okay. So I went, and I was in Hungary for one summer. And then as I went back to university, I was started learning German. That's a whole other story. And that's when the wall fell just a few months later. So I went back again the next summer. And then the issue was I was pretty much ready. I want to spend my life spreading the good news of Jesus. And I was ready to go right after college, but my parents and other wise people said, David, no, you should probably get some more education. So I went to Trinity Seminary, started getting a master's degree in missiology, which they don't even have that program anymore because it's too dangerous to have that word on your diplomas.
Where is Trinity? Where is Trinity located? That's
Deerfield, Illinois. It's just a suburb on the north side of Chicago.
Okay, for some reason I thought you went to Wheaton.
I did. I went to Wheaton first, and then after Wheaton, I went to Trinity.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So while at Trinity, the founder of this mission that I had gone to Hungary with, Operation Mobilization, came and spoke in chapel. I was invited to go have lunch with him afterwards. And he basically said, what are you doing after you graduate? I'm like, well, I don't know yet. And he's like, why don't you come and help me for a year? So that's how I got started with OM, both those summers in Hungary, and then being invited by George to be his assistant for a year. And, when I think of I remember meeting George first time he spoke on one of those summer outreaches. He was speaking to all the participants from North America before we flew over to Europe for the meetings. And it was just wild. All the women were staying with the women were staying with members of this big church, and all the men were just sleeping on the basement floor. And there was like 150 of us there, all told, and I remember him just talking. First of all, he talked so openly about his weaknesses. I mean, I'd never ever met a Christian leader who said, I struggle with sexual temptation, and like, whoa. So there was a sense of reality, like these people were living in truth and reality, but also, it's like, if Jesus is for us, who can be against us? Of course, we're going to turn the world upside down. Not in it's like an arrogant, attitude, but sort of like, not to try to do crazy things for Jesus is like, you're not trusting in his power to. And so that it was sort of blew me away that year with them, and just their wanting to do these things and doing these what otherwise would have been sort of crazy, unthinkable things, and yet they just did it. So anyways, long story short, graduated from seminary, and I went to London and was George's gopher. And then I
understood that was a common thing for him, right? To have a gopher, and explain for people who don't know what's basically the job description of a OM gopher.
Tim, it's funny you asked that, because when I asked him that too, I've been trained, you have to have job descriptions and all this stuff. So when I first arrived in London, he took me for a walk, and I said, George, what's my job description? He said, anything, anytime, anywhere.
Good thing you were single at the time.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, that wouldn't go over with the UK Labor Office.
Oh yeah, right. Now,
But
for people who don't know about OM, one of the things, and I think we have some mutual family friends who their children have been on the ship. But explain a little bit about they have the ship still, right? That they use that goes around the world.
Yeah, they have. Well, long story. They had one ship called the Lagos. It sank in an accident off the coast of Argentina in 1980. They then after that. Oh boy, hang on. I gotta fix this thing here. This thing's gonna shut me down. There we go. Are we still? You still there?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Fine.
So they after that thing was sank, a whole bunch of people around the world gave a bunch of money, so they were able to buy a new ship, which they called a Lagos Hope. So that one, but before that, I forgot to mention they had got another ship in the 70s called the Doulos, and so they had the Lagos, then the Doulos, then the Lagos Hope, and then the Doulos didn't have a shipwreck, but it was the oldest, passenger ship in the whole world. It was in the Guinness Book of Records for a long time, and it was getting so incredibly expensive to keep it up to seaworthy standards and repairs. And finally, they just said they sold it for scrap metal, and God's church rose up, gave a whole bunch of money, and they were able to buy a replacement called Doulos Hope now. And the ships basically, they have gone around the world. In the early years, they did just a lot of evangelism through literature. They would just bring this huge book fair on the boat where people could come on the boat and get books in and they go in these countries where such books weren't really so accessible. Of course, this was in sort of the pre-internet days, but even today, they still that part of their ministry is a big thing, whether it's the Lagos Hope or the Doulos. So in that way, it's a little bit different than let's say the Mercy ships, which are very much more focused, not exclusively on medical missions and humanitarian aid. Though I think OM ships do some humanitarian aid as well. But it's been a great place for people in the church worldwide to sort of to mingle, because OM brings in people. The ship's crew is made up of basically sort of like a little foretaste of heaven. You've got believers from pretty much every country, and they all have to learn to live together. Because we're gonna have to learn to live together when we get to heaven too.
Right.
And
right. We're not going to be given some kind of injection that helps us to be unified.
Yeah.
So these ships will go to ports like in Lebanon and even Islamic difficult places.
Yeah.
Do they and are there ever problems with that with Islam or I know sometimes there's even problems with piracy, right? From what I've heard, they have to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, that is a risk. In fact, just this last year, I traveled to London for the funeral of sort of the Thanksgiving service of George Verwer, and who did I see there? But Fauzia, who's been sort of working with his team for the last over 25 years, 30 years, and she was on either the Lagos or the Doulos back in the early 90s when a terrorist came in the Philippines, threw a bomb in this book center, exploded. Several people were critically injured, and one person I think even died. I can't remember, but Fauzia was critically injured, and I mean, like, she barely lived through it, and she has scars all over her body. But so OM just took her in, and she's been serving all these years in London ever since. So there's a price to pay when you do risky things like that. But on the other hand, it's been great to see how doors open. Anyone who goes online and just searches on the internet can figure out that these ships have got a Christian aspect to it, and yet they still keep going to very Islamic countries, and they still keep getting accepted. And partly because, I think part of what did Jesus say? Knock on the door will be open to you. A lot of times we think, oh, you can't do that. No, that's impossible. Well, have you ever tried? Well, why don't you
Yeah.
just ask? Who knows? They may say yes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that sort of segues us into my next question, and that is, how did you? Now, I remember when uh, we finished our summer trip, and then a few years later, I learned that you were in Turkmenistan. And if people don't know,
Mhm.
Turkmenistan
Yeah.
is one of the republics of the former Soviet Union.
Mm.
And so how did you find yourself there, and what was that ministry like?
Well, Tim, like when George asked me what I wanted to do, I didn't know. I knew I wanted to take the gospel to the nations, but I wasn't one of these sort of people who had a specific call to the Turks or to this world or this or that. I was just sort of like, send me anywhere. So during my time with George, I was thinking and praying and saying, Lord, where should I go after this? And part of me was sort of saying, I there's that verse in Luke 12 where it says, to whom much is given shall much be required. And on the one hand, I don't see myself as anything special, but I do feel I've been blessed with a family that loved me a lot. I had parents who loved Jesus, and they modeled and all they did. I have churches around me who have loved me and have been willing to send me out into missions so that finance wasn't an issue and all these different things. And so it's always been in my mind, if I don't go to these other places that other people can't go, who will go? And so
Yes.
I was
Mm.
thinking, where can I go? And right in the end of my year with George, I came across a report about Turkmenistan where they said they had like 20 missionaries and there's only like 10 believers in the whole country. And I'm
Mm.
like, what can that
Mm.
be? So when I, read a little bit closer, I'm like, wow, I should go there. So, and this is right after the Soviet Union had fallen apart. And so uh, there were open doors. So I'm like, yeah, let's go for it. So that was my reason. I wanted to go to the toughest, most difficult, most neglected corner of the planet. And Turkmenistan seemed like the best place to start.
Huh. So what
Yeah.
now, as I recall, the leader of Turkmenistan was much more dictatorial than, say, some of the other republics of the former
Yeah.
Soviet Union. What was that like to minister in a place like that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's funny. He would have probably considered himself a benevolent dictator because he's not one of these guys who took over power by killing a bunch of people. He just worked up the communist system and was a nice, obedient communist. So they entrusted him with that republic down there. And then all of a sudden, the Soviet Union collapsed all around him. So he's the one who just looked around himself and found himself with the reins of power
Uh-huh.
in his hands.
Okay.
He was typical communist in that he wanted everyone to be dependent on him. So this whole idea of people, working for Western countries and getting salaries from other places and being able to do that stuff and no longer needing him, that sort of stuff he didn't like.
Mm.
So he sort of dabbled with Western freedoms for a while, and then there was a backlash in '98 when he said, "Forget this," and that's when he sort of pushed out a lot of people, including us. And to be fair, it wasn't just a religious. It wasn't like anti-Christian. It was more like anti-West. This is too much freedom for me and my people.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, I think there've been that sort of a mindset that's been in in Turkmenistan and probably even in much of Central Asia for a long time.
Mm. So following that experience, then you got kicked out of the country, essentially out of
Yeah,
Turkmenistan, right? And then
yeah.
you found yourself in Turkey. So I wanted to have you talk a little bit about that. And somewhere
Mhm.
in between there, you also met your wife, right?
Yeah,
And you were married.
yeah,
So
yeah. So my wife was already a missionary in Turkmenistan when we came there. So that's where we met.
mm,
And we we just we had a great way of getting to know each other. We baptized people together, we buried people together long before any romance was on the scene. So when finally that sort of became a topic, we had already known each other quite well from ministering
right,
all the time, so it
right.
moved quite quickly. But it was shortly after we got married when all these Westerners were starting to get kicked out of Turkmenistan. So we we had been married less than a year when we moved to from Turkmenistan to Turkey.
Now, one of the things that I would say characterizes you and sets you apart from many of the missionaries that I've known in Central Asia and people who go into Islamic countries and so forth, is the fact that you do street evangelism. You're out on the streets, very clearly sharing the gospel, and in very visual ways and so forth. So were you able to do that in Turkmenistan, or did you attempt that, and what was the result?
Yeah, I mean, in Turkmenistan, I don't know if we did like going out in the streets. I don't think we did on the. I think we did sometimes where we went out and gave out literature door to door. We did some things like that, but just having you know, you have to, where is that line between stupidity and timidity? Is the boldness line.
Right,
and it's different in different cultures. And just the fact that we tried to openly have a church and didn't hide it publicly, so we talked about that, was huge. And that attracted a lot of attention, and all the former KGB were there to watch us too. But the street evangelism stuff, we didn't really do that. And to be honest, you have to, each one of us has to find, where is that, what does it mean to be a bold witness in my, where I find myself in this stage of life and where I'm at. It's different for different people. And I remember when we were being forced to leave Turkmenistan, my wife would have liked to go to Afghanistan, and I'm like, hey, yeah, let's go. She's like, or no, she said, let's go. And I said to her, Ulrika, we could go there, but I want to be real public and open in the ministry we do. And if I do that sort of stuff now while the Taliban is in power, we'll have a great, incredible ministry for about 1 week, and then I'll be dead, and then it'll be all over.
Right.
So I don't think it's something you have to necessarily assume that should be done everywhere. Of course, if you live in a little teeny village, what's the use of street evangelism? You won't see many people on the streets.
Right. There might just be one street.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So you eventually found yourself in Turkey, in Istanbul, and tell us a little bit about that experience.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I tell people, remember when John the Baptist's disciples came to him and he said, John, look at all the people are leaving us and they're going to that Jesus of Nazareth guy over there. He's taking all our people. And John very wisely said, he must increase, I must decrease. And then he said, no one can, you can only receive that which is given to you from heaven. That's a great phrase. And the way I sort of see it is, each one of us as Christians have to live with the lampstand lit and ready, and in all our life just be seeing where the opportunities God has given for me to be a light, to speak up. And in my case, if I would have shown up 20 years before in Turkey, I don't know if we would have been able to do the things we did, but we just happened to show up in a time when Erdogan had come into power, and he had been in jail for 6 months because the secular generals in Turkey did not like the fact that he was trying to spread Islam again in Turkey. So when he came to power, he wanted to really encourage all the Muslims in Turkey to re-Islamicize the Turkish culture, but he also wanted to take vengeance on those secular generals. And his way of doing it was to create a law which made it a crime to prevent someone from spreading their faith.
Oh,
so that's like one step above typical religious freedom. I mean, it's one thing to have the right to do it. It's another thing to get punished if you dare stop someone from doing it.
Right.
So of course he did that so that to motivate the Muslims in Turkey to stop being afraid of the secularists and open their mouths and start spreading Islam again. He didn't realize that there may be some crazy nuts like me who also might want to benefit from that law. So that's really our start with street evangelism in Turkey. Is like we were just living there, and boom, this door opened in front of us. And we're like, could it be? I mean, I've never heard of a law like that in any other Muslim country anywhere, not even in a Western country. So, me and a couple of my friends were like, someone needs to go out and actually see if they're going to put their money where their mouth is. Are they really mean this? So what we did is we just invited a street evangelist from Dublin, Ireland, came over, and he gave us a week of training on how to do street evangelism. Just classic, using sketchboards and paintings and things to attract the interest of passersby, and then be able to talk to them. That's what we started doing. And God gave us many, many wonderful years after that of great opportunities to proclaim the gospel to small and big crowds all throughout Istanbul and other cities of Turkey.
I would imagine some of your conversations were fairly spirited. I was involved
Yeah.
in a street evangelism campaign very briefly in Austria, in Vienna in 2009, and sort of observing what was going on. And we oftentimes, people, after you're finished talking, they'll want to continue on with a dialogue or an argument. And so what do you remember some of the interesting experiences that you had with that? I mean, did you feel like you were in a very, difficult debate intellectually with someone, or was it clear that the person was just angry and wasn't going to listen to any logical explanation? Or
I think I had all those reactions over the years, and I would dare say that anyone who's done evangelism, for any short of time, knows that when the true gospel is preached, you will always have strong reactions on all sides. Now, you can water down the gospel so that no one ever gets angry because there's nothing offensive in it, or you can be so abrasive and offensive that no one ever responds, they just get angry. But I think when you really preach it, you get strong in both directions, and that's what we've seen. And I remember once we were invited to come to the capital of Turkey, to Ankara, and I didn't know that city very well, so we just said, well, where there's lots of people. So there's this park right in the downtown, and lots of people said, well, let's go there. We started preaching. I didn't know it was right in front of the, what should I say, the Congress or the Parliament or some like big major government stuff was right next to us.
The chambers of power.
Because, there sure were a lot of police around there, and a lot of them had these huge big machine guns. And I'm like, well, doesn't that seem a little bit over the top? But then I understand. So I started talking, and sure enough, boom, this crowd came, and mixed with policemen with their guns and everything. I'm like, wow, we got an interesting crowd here. And I'll remember right near the end, someone says, "The Bible's been changed. We don't want to hear this anymore." and there's another guy in the crowd. He says, "Wait a sec, I want to listen to what this guy has to say." And the first guy got so angry that other guy wanted to listen to us that they got in a fight. So this fight broke out in the crowd. Then, of course, the police were everywhere. So woof, they immediately stepped in, took those guys away, and they shut us all down. But those things happen all the time when we were in Turkey. But I found that in Paul, and going back to Philippians, Paul says, if you imitate, you cast. He said, "You imitate me, and the God of peace will be with you." And I think, how could you say that imitating this crazy nutcase who did all these ridiculous things would ever lead to a peaceful life? I don't think necessarily it's peaceful, but the God of peace will be with you in that times. And then you got that verse in chapter 4 where it says, "The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your heart and your mind in Christ Jesus." And that is what I've experienced. But when you go and do these things, which you believe God's calling you to do, even though they're a bit risky, you discover that it's not that I have this great courage, or that I'm or that there may not be dangers there, but somehow there's this peace that is guarding my thoughts and my heart from. Because I remember even when I was in jail, sometimes I had ISIS fighters who hate Americans sleeping in the same room with me. I mean, if there's ever a reason and to be afraid, that would be it. And I just slept like a baby. Yeah. And I don't think, again, because I'm anything great. It's because this peace was there guarding my heart and mind, giving me just a wonderful sleep. Sort of like Daniel in the lion's den.
Yeah, or the disciples on the Sea of Galilee, and getting the rest, or noticing that Jesus was resting. I'm glad you brought up Philippians, because one of the reasons I wanted to interview David was, when I think, if someone was to ask me, "Tim, when you think of the Apostle Paul, who do you think of living today who might best resemble Paul?" And I'm sure, David, you would be humbled for me to think this or to know this, I'm sure, but I do think of you because of your experience doing street evangelism in an Islamic country. I know your heart from back in Kazakhstan, wanting to, share Christ openly. And so I know the kind of guy you would be on a mission team. You'd be the guy that would you're the evangelist. So you'd want to be out there sharing Christ and not pussyfooting around. But I wanted to read a little bit from Philippians and then have you give me your thoughts on how your experience in prison. I mean, certainly if you wanted to get into a few more details about how your prison experience impacted you and perhaps how you see your experience through the lens of Paul as he's talking to the Philippians. But I've got to put my glasses on here. Just a moment here. Bear with me. So I'm going to read Philippians 1:12 through 19.
Yeah.
Now, I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel, so that my imprisonment in the cause of Christ has become well known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and to everyone else. And that most of the brethren, trusting in the Lord because of my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear. Some, to be sure, are preaching Christ even from envy and strife, but some also from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I'm appointed for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition rather than from pure motives, thinking to cause me distress in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in this I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that this will turn out for my deliverance or salvation through your prayers and the provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. So, as I'm studying Philippians, and I understand that prison at that time was kind of a place where you're waiting around to see what's going to happen with your sentence, and you were dependent upon people bringing you things and so forth. But I wanted you to just maybe go a little bit deeper into because you weren't just imprisoned once. I think it was at least 3 or 4 times you were actually in prison. What was that like for you, your family, your wife, and how did you cope with thinking about their concerns and the burden that they're feeling, the fear that you might feel, and then looking at this whole thing as turning out for good? Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are indeed so many issues, and after having been in jail a few times, I sometimes despair. How could I ever obey that verse later on in the New Testament where it says, and remember those in prison as if you were in prison with them? I mean, how that's not easy to do, because it's woof. I mean, how many of us do that? I mean, but I will say that, looking back, it was hard on my wife. It was hard on our kids, but I think especially on my wife, because she had to carry a lot of the stress and the fallout of it. I mean, this is the beauty of God's church, is that when the tough times come, remember I said in the New Testament where if you're going to suffer, don't suffer for doing wrong, but suffer as a Christian, because you've done right. And there's a big difference there. And when you're suffering for Christ, God's church comes around you in a beautiful way. And the way people from all over the world, came alongside us and helped us, prayed for us, sent messages, was just amazing. And my wife, of course, experienced that too. But I think for me, it's funny. The first time I was in jail was just for a couple of days, so it wasn't that big of a thing, and it was sort of over right after it got started. So that gave me a chance to think about it and sort of process what was going on and understand what God was doing. So by the time I was able to go a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth time, I was ready, and by God's grace, He prepared me. And it's funny, we talk about the things that the church doesn't get right in theology, or there's these mistakes, and Christians who should know better, why haven't they read their Bible? One of the ones I don't understand is that the Bible clearly says in the New Testament that suffering for Christ is something over which we should rejoice, and it's an honor. And yet so often we don't do that, do we? We see we see, suffering is like, oh boy, I wasn't careful enough. I need to be careful so that doesn't happen again. But that's not what the Bible says. The first thing we should do before we do any like evaluating and whatever is just rejoice and say, praise God, my name is written in heaven. God, there's nothing in this world that can do. And
Mhm.
I think of the sort of one of the big role models for me was the apostles when they were beaten in Jerusalem and they were told, don't talk about Jesus anymore. They didn't leave and say, oh, my back hurts, and oh man, I need to get better health care and this and that, or
Right.
why don't people care for us? It was they were rejoicing that they had been considered worthy of suffering for the name.
Yeah.
And so when I look at all I have been privileged for, I'm like, who am I that God considered me worthy of suffering for the name? That that is just a thing that blows my mind away. Who am I? I'm just a nobody. I'm just a little guy from the
Yeah.
Pacific Northwest. But God gave me this great honor. He says, I'm gonna let you go into jail. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego know what I'm talking about because they know that you meet God in a special way in the furnace of
Hmm.
difficulties.
Yes.
And so am I saying that everyone should go get themselves thrown in jail so they can experience Jesus in a
No.
more amazing way? Maybe. I mean,
There are other forms of jail. I don't want you to
yeah,
take off. I don't want to pull away from your where you're
yeah.
headed, but I just briefly I can so relate to what you were saying because uh,
Mhm.
upon my retirement from Portland Public Schools, having
Yeah,
taught 30 years in one of the most liberal school districts in the United States and
yeah,
having challenges as a Christian dealing
yeah,
with that and all the stuff going on with equity and all that jazz.
yeah,
And
yeah.
then I won't go into all the details, but right at the period of I was just months away from my retirement. And for me, I realize now looking back, I made my retirement into an idol because I
Mm,
thought this all of my rest, the book of Hebrews says we have not yet entered the rest. The
yeah,
rest is when Jesus comes back and
yeah,
everything is put right and
yeah.
God is on and we see it all, it comes to full fruition.
Mhm.
We have not yet entered that rest.
Yeah.
And in my mind, I think I actually believe that my retirement would be my rest. And anyway, I won't
Mhm.
go into all the details, but just suffice it to say that I entered into a period of insomnia, then anxiety, and then a deep, deep depression that
Mhm.
affected me, my wife, people around me in ways it did in a sense it did feel like a prison that I was never going to get out of. I
Mhm.
definitely felt like I was in a miry pit. And then
Mhm.
my kids moved, my grandkids, and then I was faced with this, wait a minute, I'm not going to be a West Coast guy living in Oregon in the beautiful Pacific Northwest in my
Yeah.
dream retirement house and
Yeah.
my dream retirement little world.
Yeah.
And just having to move, and I hated the idea of having to move where I'm at now, which I now love. It's great. But you know
Mhm.
what's really interesting, Dave, is that when I got here, the first person I met was a mutual friend of a Canadian friend I have. And this guy was about 80 years old, and he was going through his own anxiety and depression. And God just immediately put us together. And I realized,
Mm.
okay, the fog is starting to lift. And
Yeah.
now I'm realizing
Yeah.
why. I mean, sure, all that stuff was for me to be shaped. And in a
Mhm.
sense, I realized I have this idol. I call it almost like geographical idolatry because I thought Oregon is the only place I can be happy. The Pacific Northwest is the only. I have my friends
Yeah.
here. I have my dream
Yeah.
house. I got my HVAC. I got my carpeting. I got all this
Mhm.
stuff, going back to the white picket fence stuff.
Yeah.
And I have my rest. I've entered my rest. No, I did not. I actually
Yeah.
entered my turmoil.
Yeah.
But but God used that to show
Yeah.
me, I can
Yeah.
bless you in Northwest Arkansas, a place you
Yeah.
never dreamed you would live.
Yeah.
And you can be happy and content, and your grandkids will be all around you. And
Yeah.
I'll send you people. And there's other stories of
Yeah.
people that God has sent who have had similar
Mhm.
issues. And I used to be one of those guys that was like, come on, get with it. Why are you depressed? You're a Christian, aren't you?
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah.
Christians don't get depressed. And now I
Yeah.
have a totally different view of mental health
Yeah.
issues
Yeah.
and a certain empathy
Yeah.
with people who are going
Yeah.
through that I never had before.
Mhm.
So I say a hearty amen to what you're saying,
Yeah.
and how God can, no servant is greater than his master, and
Yeah.
this is the road, this is the Messiah road that
Mhm.
we all, and that's Paul, one of Paul's points in
Yeah.
Philippians, right?
Yeah.
There's this road, there's this story
Yeah.
that I want to bring you into, this story of dying to yourself, giving things up, counting
Yeah.
your status as
Yeah.
not exploiting your status, uh,
Yeah.
and bringing you eventually to glory, and giving you the
Yeah.
hope of the resurrection. But anyway, I wanted
Yeah.
you to continue, but I had
Yeah.
to insert
Yeah.
that just to say,
Yes.
man, you are so right on
Yeah.
with what you
Yeah.
said.
Yeah. And there's so many different directions we can go from this, but when you share that, it reminds me of, and I see this especially in Western Europe, and especially in Germany, and especially in Eastern Germany, so many people who are just racked with doubts and like, where is God? And if there's a God, why is this happening? And this and that. And it's almost as if they want to believe, but they just can't get past these doubts. And I remember some wise sage, or maybe it was in a book or something like that, said, doubts are overcome not so much by reflection as by action. And what he means is, you're not sure if something is true or not, but you just start moving. You start doing what you sort of like want to believe in, but are not quite able to believe. And then in the act of doing it, you you sort of get your answers that you were looking for. And I know with me, when I look back at my life, I do feel pity for these people who have massive doubts, but I feel like I can't. It's almost like I can't doubt because I've seen too much. Because
Mhm.
God's given me this privilege of, you see these things in the Bible, you see Paul saying, imitate me. And then you see all these amazing things that was going on in the book of Acts. I'm like, oh, well, I don't know, but somehow by God's grace, I took some steps. I said, okay, I'll try it. And then boom, you see how God is alive in our world. He's working. Muslims are getting saved. Miracles are happening. And God's given me like front row seat to just miracle after miracle
Yeah.
of lives changed. I mean, the stories I could tell you of the Turks who've come to know Jesus, it's very hard for a human like me to see those things and then doubt that
Sure.
God's around. He's just
Yeah.
he's everywhere. But of course, the tricky thing is you actually have to step out and say, okay, God, I'll take a step. Peter didn't know he could walk on the water, but he had to get out. He put his feet on the water, and then he discovered there's a God who will keep him up.
Right. Right.
So
So what were some of the things, Paul talks about this, his ability to penetrate the Roman power centers, he's
mhm,
sharing with the Praetorium,
mhm.
the Imperial Guard, and they're hearing about it. Maybe just people are gossiping in town and
Yeah,
saying, this Paul guy, did you hear about? Oh yeah, I heard about
yeah,
him. What's he talking about?
yeah,
Oh, he's talking about
yeah,
some king, a Jew. He was
yeah,
crucified, and
yeah,
without them even knowing it, it's like Pontius Pilate putting up the
yeah,
sign, without,
yeah,
or Caiaphas
yeah,
saying, yeah, it's better that one guy die than the whole nation perish,
yeah,
without even realizing the stuff is coming out of their mouths, which is basically
yeah,
proclamation, and
yeah,
Paul's rejoicing about this. So, you've
yeah.
shared with me, when we've had you at our home a couple of times in Oregon, and, you've
Mhm.
shared with me some specifics, but is there anything that stands out to you as, wow, I wouldn't have seen that unless I'd been here in this prison?
Yeah, it is. Let me grab this battery here real quick. I want to make sure my phone battery doesn't die. But yes, that is in fact, Tim, those verses you shared in some ways are the ones that I sort of feel I understand way better now than I did before. And because again, Paul is not there saying, "Oh, I'm in prison, and oh, these chains hurt my arms." That wasn't even a topic worth wasting breath on. He's like, people, these believers in this town who were afraid have been, through my chains, have become more bold. I mean, that I saw this in Turkey too. You'd think that my being thrown in jail logically would cause people to say, okay, well, this obviously is too risky. We just sort of need to back off and calm down, circle the wagons, be quiet. That's not what happened. I know Turkish believers, they like, if Dave is in jail, we're going to keep preaching.
Yeah.
And they did all this other stuff. They were encouraged to be more bold, which is illogical. That's not what should happen, but it does happen when gospel workers get put in jail for the gospel. And just the whole logic, if you look at the verses after that too, how Paul was not one of these nitpicks who are saying you have to do it just my way and this way is the right way and all these ones are not as effective or not exactly theologically perfect. He's like, even if they preach for bad motives, I rejoice if the gospel is preached. You know, that is amazing. That to me is the heart of an evangelist. Is he knows, like Paul did, that he said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God to save. It's not me, it's not my cleverness, it's not my methods.
Right.
This message, you just sort of had to let it loose and it does what it does, whether you have good motives or not. And you and I both know people who have come to know Jesus and they were led to Christ by people who have left the faith since then or you know, become atheists or whatever.
Right.
Because it's the message, it's God himself.
Yeah, it's alive. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You mentioned to me, you mentioned ISIS earlier, but I think I recall you talking about some Afghan guy that had become a believer. And what was that all about?
Yeah, well, one of the times I was in jail, my wife, again, God providentially provided a born again evangelical nun from Germany to just so happen to be staying with us then, who and they have these things in Germany. They are, we think of, Catholics when we think of nuns, but she was visiting us and she was able to help my wife with all the things that were going on while I was in there. And she would accompany my wife every day when she came to the jail to visit me because I was allowed to have like 10 minutes a day with my wife. So she would be outside. The two of them would be in line waiting to come in to see me. And I could go into the bathroom at the jail cell, this big area where I look out the window and I could see them. So one day I saw him out there and I was talking from the window down to them below. And this guy in the bathroom overheard me speaking English. So he walked up to me and he started talking with me in English. And he was an Afghan who'd worked for a Christian Norwegian aid organization in his country. And sadly, they had never really, that I know of, told him anything about Jesus. Not necessarily because they weren't Christian or, maybe they were, but I think they probably were just so afraid that they didn't dare do that for fear of losing their contract or getting those people in trouble. I don't know, whatever the case. This guy was impressed with these Norwegian Christians who had worked in his country with whom he'd worked. For whatever reasons, he felt he needed to flee. So he was caught by the police in Istanbul trying to get into Europe and was put in this deportation center. So there we were. But of course, he spoke with those Norwegians all the time in English. So we started talking, and there was a bunch of Afghans and Pakistanis who also had been caught like him, trying to get into Europe, and many of them had been traveling 2 weeks without any change of clothes or any shower. So the room where they were in, it did not smell very well.
I can imagine.
So I told Ahmed, and we talked about lots of things, but I said, hey, my wife is going to come visit me every day. Tomorrow morning, I can just tell her, or I could just call her and say, hey, we need a bunch of, underwear and t-shirts because they can't even take a shower. I mean, they have to put on their dirty clothes again because they don't even have a second pair of clothes. So anyways, my wife brought all that stuff in. I don't know how we got through the police check. I mean, they probably thought, man, this guy's planning on staying in here. 50 pairs of underwear. We got it through. He and Ahmad and I, we went in there and we gave them out. It was like Christmas, in the middle of summer, like Santa Claus. And they were all very happy, but the ISIS guys were furious because they were in another room and they saw all this.
Not because they wanted the underwear. It's not because they wanted the underwear. No.
They were furious that Ahmed, as a Muslim, was helping an infidel like me to do these nice things there to try and brainwash them.
Mm-hmm.
So they took him aside and they said, "Don't you dare help that infidel anymore, or we're going to pour boiling water over you." Because Turkish police are smart; they're not going to let them take their weapons in there. But ISIS guys are smart; they know how to terrorize people, even if they don't have guns. They have to have tea there, so they got a kettle. So they figured at least we could pour boiling water on him. Long story short, the police realized things were getting very hot and dangerous in there, so they just let Ahmed out in the street with a bunch of the other Afghans. They just let him go, and shortly thereafter, I was let go too. So again, there's way too many details I can share, but anyways, Ahmed was able to connect with me miraculously a day or two after he was released, and he came in our house, stayed overnight, spent the whole night in our living room reading a New Testament that we had on the shelf in there.
Wow.
And it didn't even dawn on me that he had never had one of these in his hands. And you and I, we live with multiple copies and multiple different translations, and he gets this, and it just blew him away. He couldn't sleep the whole night, just read it through. We woke up the next morning, he battered us with all these questions. What does this verse mean? What does this verse mean? That morning was Sunday morning. He went to church with us. He was blown away too. It did not fit all these lies he had been told about what Christians do in their secret in their religious gatherings. And he was just blown away by the truth of God's word, what Jesus had done, how Christians acted in church, and he became a Christian that afternoon. Boom.
Wow.
And he's
so
been
that's a great example of how the proclamation of the gospel combined with the modeling of what you did and then what he saw in the church, how they go together, which is again one of the themes in Philippians too. So I recall too, and I don't know if this story turned out the same way for you, but you had mentioned that in the prison there was a Turkish transvestite or something one time, or what were you able to share Christ with that person?
What had happened is they put me on this floor with it's too many details to go into here, but there is a Chechen drug addict terrorist guy who overheard me talking with some other guys, and I just sort of mentioned in passing, but Muhammad isn't a real prophet. And anyways, we were having this discussion of real sort of private. There's a bunch of guys around us listening.
That'll push buttons.
He walks through the whole jail. There's 200 guys in there. He says, "This infidel here just blasphemed our prophet." So he's like trying to basically turn the whole place into a riot. The police came in, because they're watching all this on the cameras. They rushed in, whisked me away, and decided it was no longer safe for me to live in there. So they ended up putting me in the individual cells, or solitary confinement. But it wasn't solitary because there was like 3 or 4 of the cells. They left all the front doors open so we all could just go back and forth to the bathroom if we needed to. Yeah. And the cell next to me, 2 of the cells were empty. The other cell had a Brazilian transvestite in it. The reason he or she was in there was because she, what you going to put him on the men's floor? Right. He looked like a woman, so he's going to have problems there, especially
for safety. Yeah.
And what do you do? Put him in the Flint women's floor? He was born as a man, and so they just said safest thing is to put him in this other floor. So in this individual cell. So I just spent a week with this Brazilian transvestite, and it was a great. Everyone's debating this LGBT stuff nowadays, but it gave me great insight, because as he or she was telling me her story, she was born to a prostitute. No one knows who her father is. Even her mother, because she was sleeping with multiple guys every night or whatever. I don't know how it happened. Anyways, her mother was a drug addict, so it was her aunt had to raise her. And right from an early age, everyone was saying, "Oh, you're so feminine. You're not like a boy." And so, well, what are you going to do? Your whole life, you have no father, and everyone's saying you look like a girl. Eventually, he started believing. He's like, "Oh, well, it must be." So,
like a self-fulfilling prophecy or something.
So she moved to Rio de Janeiro. That's what she lived on the streets there. Got involved in drug scene and all this everything. life fell apart. She just wanted to leave. She managed to get to use someone else's Portuguese passport or something to get on a flight to get to Europe. And she lived in Europe for many years. And then she became like a mistress to an Arab oil sheik who was gay or something. So this was his like little mistress, which he kept in the back of his house, and no one really even knew she was there except for a
Mm,
couple of his close buddies, because he had to keep up the appearance of being a good
right.
Muslim. But
Right.
she told me they would hop on a plane and fly to Paris for the weekend and just party away in the gay bars or whatever, and
Huh.
in Paris, and then fly back to Saudi Arabia and live this other life. And anyway, I mean, she shares all this, but I'll never forget at the end of this thing, she had told me also like how she'd been traveling through Italy once, and before she linked up with that Arab guy, and this priest just took her in when she was just on the street with nothing. And was kind to her, some Catholic priest, and a couple and she was not at all on a spiritual, you know, journey trying to find out the answer of life or anything. But just after she shared all this stuff, sort of as an afterthought, she says, looking back on my life, it all was, and she used an expletive, it all was the S word, except for those times when I was with Christians.
Hmm. Wow.
And I just sort of
Wow.
dawned on her, looking back, and
Huh.
because there's this Christian who's all of a sudden locked up with her in jail for a week and being nice and kind of friendly. I wasn't even trying to sort of be nice and kind of friendly. I mean, what do you do when you're locked up in this room with this person who's had these incredible tragedies? Your heart breaks.
Yeah.
And she was just touched by noticing that it was these Jesus followers were the ones that are always nice to
Hmm.
her.
Hmm.
And I tried to stay in touch with her after that. Never heard from her again. I don't know what
Who
happened, but
knows?
yeah,
God determines the time set for them and the exact places where they should live.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
you might hear someday, but praise
yeah.
God that
Amen.
there was, knowing you, she clearly heard the gospel and
Oh yeah,
and saw the
yeah,
love of Christ in
yeah,
both you and the priest. So
yeah,
that's all
yeah,
good. So
yeah,
so needless to say, through these imprisonments, then the Turkish government, I guess, decided it was time for you to go. So you essentially, it became clear to you, as I recall, that you needed to exit stage
yeah,
right.
yeah. Well, at the very end, they had arrested me yet again, and it happened right after. You may remember there was an American missionary in Turkey named Andrew Brunson who was in jail for 2 years while Trump was president, and Trump did all these
Right.
things to try and get him out of office, or try to get him set free, and finally he did. And the day after he was set free is when they arrested me. In fact, I don't know. I sort of feel it was the policeman who had been trying 2 years long to try and throw mud on Andrew Brunson and make him look like this, CIA agent or whatever, and were furious that their president had let him go. Now I sort of fell in their lap, and I'm like, "Rrr." So they, in
No,
fact,
Dave,
well, they were,
maybe you didn't have your MAGA hat on or something.
yeah.
Would
Well,
have given you immunity.
yeah, I mean, the irony is great irony because basically, it's sort of while they were interrogating me and holding me in prison is when Andrew Brunson was in the White House praying. You may remember after he was set free, it was
I
a sort of a
do. I
photo
do.
op. He was
Yeah.
whisked
Yeah.
into the White House and he prayed
Right.
for him.
Right.
So uh, anyway, so you could say that's sort of the political side, and there is, so much things even in the Bible in our own lives. There's different layers. It's what's happening on the spiritual realm, what's happening in our families, what's happening politically, and all these things, sort of intersected in that. But they told me I had to leave the country, and I called the U.S. Embassy and I said, "Look, I have," because a year and a half before the Supreme Court of Turkey had made a temporary injunction which prevented the government from deporting me until they had time to look at this case, which I had opened contesting their attempts to either deny me residency or to deport me. Anyways, I said, I don't have a residence permit, but an injunction from the Supreme Court is a de facto residence permit. Because if they say the government can't deport you, well, it's that's like a residence permit, isn't it? But the U.S. government, I'll never forget the U.S. Embassy official. They said, technically, we're not allowed to give you legal advice, but we would be very glad if you would not cause problems with the Turkish government right now after all these problems we've had with Andrew Brunson. Please, please leave the country. So I remember talking. For me, it wasn't me. It wasn't what they said. I talked to Turkish church leaders and I said, "Hey, this is a situation. What should I do?" Because they all saw what was going on in Turkey
Yeah.
then, and it was the church leaders who said, "No, David, I think this is the right time. You should do what
Mm.
they said." Of course, and they assured me, the Turkish government officials, they said, "It's just a little technicality. You just have to leave the country once, and then everything's done. And then they said, and then we'll let you back in." Well,
Mm-hmm.
either that was a bald-faced lie, or the guy had been deceived, and his upper guys above him were
Echelons.
planning on
Yeah.
slamming the door shut after I left. So I did leave, and then when I tried to get back in a few weeks later, I was told at the airport I had an unlimited entry ban,
Mm.
permanent
Mm.
entry ban. So
Mm.
that's what I've been living with for the last 5 years, and that's why we're in Germany, not Turkey.
So you're in Berlin. Your wife is she from Berlin?
No, she's from southern Germany near Stuttgart.
Oh, okay. The Bavaria, is that Bavaria area?
No, Bavaria would be the eastern southeast.
Okay.
Baden-Württemberg is the southwest.
Okay. Okay. And so, but aren't you living in a Turkish community in Berlin?
Well, yeah, Berlin, like many big cities, is become very multiculti, and there's certain neighborhoods of Berlin that have a very high percentage of immigrants, and this particular neighborhood is one that has a very, very high. So it's not just Turks. We have lots of Arabs. We have lots of just non-Germans, non-Western Europeans, and Ulrika and I, we felt, very much that was exactly where we needed to be, because with all our experience in the Muslim world and working with Turks, we are the right people to live in a neighborhood like this. And so the house that we live in here was vacated by a nice young German family who was trying to raise their 3 little kids, and were deathly afraid of sending their kids to the primary school down the street, which has 95% Muslim students.
Oh, wow.
So here they are in their own country, and they're afraid of raising their children in this neighborhood. So they left, which enabled us to move into this house. And so
Yeah.
we're
So are
we're
you
just
operating? Are you operating mostly in English, German, Turkish, or all three?
happy. Great question. It just changes all the time.
Mm-hmm.
We The 3 most important languages in Berlin are German, English, and Turkish, and we
Hmm.
use them all the time. In fact,
Wow.
we were in Turkmenistan. I learned Russian. In fact, I even preached in Russian a couple times there. But after the war broke out in Ukraine, there was this initial wave of refugees, and we had a young Ukrainian family from Mariupol, one of the towns that the Russians took over there. They showed up here and stayed with us for a week or two, and so all of a sudden I had to brush up my Russian, and it sort of came back to
Oh,
life.
wow.
So, and the Ukrainians and Russians are still all over the place here since the war
Uh-huh.
began. So,
Uh-huh.
there already were some, and now there's even more. So, I find myself, when I do go out in the streets with the gospel here in Berlin, I oftentimes am using all 4 languages every day.
Are you doing like, what's a day in the life of Dave Byle look like? Are you doing street evangelism like
I
24/7, or are you doing computer? Are you doing online stuff? Or
Oh
I, th-
man,
I
Tim, it's a whole blend of different things. I don't get to do evangelism near as much as I'd like. We usually go out Friday and Saturday afternoons, but when the weather gets better and when we have these big long outreaches, then we go 6 days a week, 6, 7 hours a day, just full, all guns blazing. Of course, that's the happiest days of my life, because I
right.
I always tell people, I don't care what your gift is, whether it's this or that. I say, but you go out on the street and you spend 6 hours telling people about Jesus, and then just try not to be happy after that.
Uh-huh.
It's very difficult. I know hardly anyone who can do it.
Uh-huh.
When we come together after 6 hours of telling about Jesus, we're all just bouncing off the walls
High
for
as a
joy.
kite.
And be
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So, how can we be praying for your ministry now? I mean, what would be some specific things people listening could think about doing in
Yeah,
terms of intercession for you?
yeah. Thanks, Tim. A lot of issues. One, I was just sharing in a church yesterday. that Berlin is full of broken, lonely people, and there's addiction everywhere. There's addiction in the churches here at all levels. They have 600 brothels here in Berlin. They have tons of casinos, and of course, the alcohol and drug epidemic is all over the place here too. And it just breaks my heart to see, even in the church, people who have these just undealt with issues, and where they just aren't living in freedom. And so that would be a prayer request, that God would start with His church and just heal the church here. And you have people who have just come to Christ. Maybe they came out of horrific trauma and childhood wounds and messed up all sorts of stuff. And so there's a lot of work helping people like that and getting them to a state of spiritual healthiness. That's a prayer request. Um, uh, on the other side, there's so many refugees who are open. I mean, what breaks my heart, from all my years in Turkey, is hearing of many stories of Turks and Kurds who, in Turkey, they were fed up with Islam. They were fed up with the AK Party and Erdogan and all this Islam being forced down their throat. They want freedom, so they fled and came to Western Europe. They showed up at a place like Berlin, and they so much wanted to connect, but of course they don't know the language. So, and then you got more and more Germans who are just fed up with all these immigrants showing up, and then you've got the churches, which many times are just overwhelmed. It talks about in Matthew 24 at the end times, the love of many will grow cold. These waves of immigrants make the love of many believers grow cold too, sadly. Shouldn't be that way, but it is. And so these people came here. They would have, I think many of them would have maybe gladly come to faith or be involved in the church, but just no one showed interest in them. No one. So they just found themselves sitting days and weeks and months on end, no friends, nothing. And so what happens is they get lonely. They finally go into the Turkish subculture because that's the only people that they can communicate with, the only people who are friendly to them. And what happens? They become devout Muslims, because
Mm.
almost the whole Turkish subculture here in Western Europe is very Islamic. So you see these people who are fed up with Islam, who tried to flee Islam, and they come here to Europe and become more Islamic than they ever were. And so that's a prayer request, is that doesn't happen, that we can find these people. Like right now, there's waves and waves of Kurds coming from Eastern Turkey, fed up with, they're heartbroken with the results of their last election this last year, and with the economy's tanked. They want something else. They've come in here. They're fed up with Islam, and yet, I just feel like, how are we ever going to manage to reach all these people who are open? That it seems like there's so many people who are open, but there's just not enough churches or people who are willing to do the work. And I myself, I'm already overwhelmed with so many things
Yeah,
to do.
sure, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, it sounds like a huge task.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I would imagine if anyone wanted to give financially to you, they could do that through Operation Mobilization, correct?
Yeah, I mean, we've got. You just Google for David Byle Operation Mobilization, and it's
Okay.
probably
If you
gonna
want to
show
send
up.
me a link, I
Yep,
can put that
yep.
on the YouTube
Thank you.
description and
Yeah.
so forth. Hey, Dave, I think we've gone about an hour, a little over an hour. So I just wanted to end with just asking you, out of all of the Bible characters, you think of, and I know this is hard because there's so many interesting people. Is there someone that you connect with, relate to, or
Mhm.
appreciate? Especially now as well, you don't even have gray hair, but you still look
Mhm.
as young as ever. But as you've matured like a fine wine,
Yeah.
uh, someone that you really can appreciate or relate to or connect with.
Uh, well, I mean, there's a lot of people that inspire me in the Bible. I was just reading recently of David's mighty men, those 30 warriors, and they are incredibly, Benaiah, for example, the way they fought for King David, and that inspires me. But if I'm really honest, in answer to your question, it should be no surprise. I mean, the one who inspires me more than all is the Apostle Paul, and he says, "Imitate me as I imitate Christ." All we see in Paul's life is a life lived imitating Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And and I can't help but say that's great advice. Try and imitate Paul, like he commands us to, and that leads to one of the most amazing lives you could ever live.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing as a writer how he can weave. He has so much knowledge about the entire all the scriptures,
Mhm.
at that time, of course, it's the Old Testament for the most part, but how he can weave in so much about the
Yeah,
story of God and
yeah,
his servant, that we read about in Isaiah, and the huge eschatological view
mhm,
of what's ahead for God's people and the kingdom, and in
mhm,
Romans 8, and and how the sons of God will be revealed and creation will rejoice, and all of these things he can just bring together,
mhm.
but with that wonderful thread of Jesus,
Yeah,
going through it. And yeah,
yeah,
I would have to agree. He's definitely up there in
yeah,
my mind. Well,
yeah.
hey, Dave, is there
Yeah.
anything else you'd want to share or with us,
Uh,
or?
no, I'm just very happy on behalf of the guys, especially in your group, who are going to be experience this trip you're going to do this summer, and any other people who may be watching this. I'm just uh, thankful for what you're doing, Tim, and you're a great example of how you've made that move to Arkansas, and you took that step of faith, and God blessed, and now He's using you for His glory in these wonderful, unexpected ways, uh, with these videos and other things. So, just God bless you, brother, and thank you
Yeah,
for
well,
inviting me.
please give our best to your family. And are all
Yeah.
of your kids in the States now, or do any of them still live in Europe?
Three of them are actually in Canada studying in university there, and one of them still here in Germany, in southern Germany, and there's only one right now, our oldest, with his wife in America.
Okay, but you guys are empty nesters at this
Yeah,
point.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how are you adjusting to that? Are you enjoying
Uh,
that?
well, it's been 2 years now, so I wouldn't say it's been totally easy. Probably harder on my wife, but God is good.
Yeah.
His grace is sufficient for every day.
Yeah. Well, if you ever have grandkids, that's an amazing blessing. As
Well, I've
I'm
been
sure you've
told
heard
that, Tim.
other people. It's an incredible thing,
Wow.
and it's
Wow.
wonderful. Well, thank you so much for
Yeah.
carving out some time, and I wish you
Thank
well
you,
in
Tim.
Berlin. We'll keep you guys in prayer, and
Yeah.
maybe we'll do this again and get an update from you.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really
Yeah.
appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
All right, you
Yep.
take care, Dave.
Yep.
All
You
right,
too. God
all right.
bless.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Well, I hope you all enjoyed that interview with good friend and brother in Christ, Dave Byle, and please be praying for his ministry and the Muslim population in Berlin and Turkey and everywhere else. And we hope you enjoyed the time here with Dave and in hearing about his ministry and his work. And I'm going to just relax around the wood stove now, and we're kind of hunkered down here in the snow, uh, waiting for the temperature to go up a bit and get out from under all of this beautiful snowfall. So you guys take care wherever you're at. Stay warm and stay well. Bye bye.